Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Thrive Co-Living podcast and YouTube broadcast. Thrive Co-Living is a new concept in creative community building. Sustainable, multicultural, multi-generational, and inclusive, Thrive Co-Living communities are built from repurposed big box stores or other suitable buildings. In this series, myself, Jennifer Hooper, and Thrive founder, Mark Stein, will weave together the tapestry that makes up the physical and spiritual components of this new concept in community living. Now on with the show. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Thrive Co-Living podcast. Your hosts are myself, Jennifer Hooper, and co-founder of Thrive, Mark Stein. Hello, Mark.
Hi there. Welcome back.
Yeah, so good to be here today. We have a special guest with us. We are going to be speaking with Penny Clark. Penny is the head of research and sustainability at a project or at a company called Conscious Coliving, which is very similar to Thrive. So we were very excited to dig in and talk about some of the similarities and maybe some differences. So Penny, right off the bat, I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what your role is at Conscious Coliving, and what you guys are doing.
Great, thank you. And yeah, really lovely to join you for a chat. I'm part of Conscious Co-Living. So we're an experience and spatial design consultancy that's impact driven and helps co-living developers and operators to create co-living communities that really thrive. So I was delighted to hear about you guys because we like the word thrive.
Yeah, we're in alignment with that word, aren't we?
Yeah. So my role at Conscious Co-Living is, as you mentioned, head of research and sustainability. This is because my background is in research. I've trained in social research methods, and at the moment I'm undertaking doctoral research as well, looking at the connection between environmental sustainability and co-housing and co-living in particular. So that's some of the background and some of the experience that I bring to Conscious Co-Living.
Fantastic. And how long has Conscious Co-Living been existed?
Yeah. How long?
Pardon my grammar and my English, but I think you know what I mean. When was it founded?
So, well, maybe I could tell you a bit about the story of how we came together.
Yeah, please.
Because in a way, it was kind of a soft start. So, officially as a company, we've existed since spring of 2018. But as a group of people, we knew each other for a couple of years before that. So a few years back, a couple of my colleagues got together. They were co-living enthusiasts. They believed in the concept of co-living. And so what they did was they wanted to run a kind of weekend workshop, or they called it a weekend sprint, bringing different people together who had different sort of backgrounds and different experiences of shared living to kind of talk more about co-living and about what they saw the true potential of co-living was. So they gathered together a group of people, one of which was myself, and we came together and had this discussion. And this kind of started off an ongoing correspondence between us. We continued to meet up all the time, talking about, what is it about co-living that's special? And so over time, I think we kind of mind mapped all of these different things, and then we began to categorize them. And the categories that we saw coming up were individual well-being, a sense of community, and environmental sustainability. And eventually we had this kind of eureka moment that what is at the heart of all of these things is a sense of connection. And that's what we see as really the true potential of co-living, that it enables this sense of connection with yourself, connection with other people, and through that connection with the wider world. And so that's when we put together the Conscious Co-Living Manifesto, which is an infographic. And what we envisioned was that this could be something for co-living operators and developers to to use to think about the social and environmental impact of their co-living space. So we formed this manifesto, and then we presented this manifesto at a co-living conference in Paris back in, I think it was 2017. And it was at this point when it was well received, that we thought, actually, there's a business here based around this idea, and we can bring this idea to more people as a consultancy. So that's when we started planning, forming this consultancy, and finally launched in 2018. So yes, as a company, as a group of people, we're quite new. As a company, we're even newer. But really, like, as a business, it felt like something very organic that happened, and it's very much, as a business, we're driven by this vision of what we think the potential of co-living is.
I love it.
Yes, this is the Conscious Coliving manifesto, and this is a manifesto that we put together. All the co-founders came up with this manifesto together, and this is what we see as really the real potential of co-living. So it's centered around this idea of connection, that co-living really enables you to connect with yourself, to connect with other people through a sense of community, and also to connect with the wider world through environmental sustainability practice. And just to go a little bit deeper into those three core aspects, well-being, community, and sustainability, really, I think this sense of connection comes down to the community element. Or this is kind of, over time, this is what I've come to think, because I think when you live in a community of people, it's kind of like an extended family, right? So you become more reflective as a person, because you're constantly seeing yourself through the eyes of many others, and that different versions of you are kind of reflected back to you. And so sometimes, living with other people, you might have to confront some things about yourself which are not that flattering, and you have to learn to deal with conflict a little bit more. You can't just run away when something bad happens. You have to learn to live with the people who you're around all the time in an agreeable as possible way. So as a result, you become more reflective as a person about yourself. And also, if you're in a community with a positive dynamic, you have a sense of place, which I think is very important to people for feeling good about themselves. So you have a sense of who you are, and you have a sense of where you fit in with a group of people who you hopefully enjoy spending time with. And that's where I think the well-being element really comes in. And as for the sustainability element, I think, you can definitely say co-living spaces, operators can do a lot to encourage sustainable behaviors. So some sustainable practice comes out in that way. Sharing of amenities is completely embedded within shared living, and that has big sustainability benefits, because a lot of our emissions come from the supply chains of the things we purchase. But beyond those kind of more peripheral things, there's something deeper going on when you live in a community, because when you live with other people, you're constantly being asked to think about people other than yourself. And that's not to say that if you don't live in co-living, this isn't occurring. It's just that if you live with a larger group of people, it's kind of multiplied. You're having to do it more often and for more people. And when you're thinking about something bigger than yourself, it's only another step to think about the natural world. So it's not to say, again, that people who don't live in co-living can't think about the natural world, but just somehow living in community sort of enables and facilitates this kind of thinking more. And not only that, but if you live with a diverse group of people who all care about environmental sustainability, inevitably they're going to care about it in different ways. Some will be really keen on the energy bills, some will love cycling, and so you get to pool all of those skills and interests, and so people can influence each other as well. So there's something there too. So that to me is at the heart of why living in a community can really help us be sort of more internally healthy, and also treat the planet around us as well with more love and with more respect.
I love that. I love that core and how it's focused on connection, but not just connection with one thing. I'm a life coach, and of course, I really favor that connection with ourselves, and how important that is for our connections with other people. And I also believe in, cultivating your own intuition and inner knowing, which comes from spending time with nature in part. And so I see like all of these pieces um, in what I believe connected in your manifesto. So I'm all lit up inside. I love it.
And you're so right as well that they're all so connected.
Oh
And
yeah, absolutely.
I see what you're saying about well-being and that connection with nature being one and the same. And one other thing to add, actually, something interesting that's come out in some research that I've done, is that when you have that sense of well-being, you're more likely to not feel like you need some of the practices that are typically not necessarily very environmentally sustainable. So, kind of rampant consumerism, always needing to buy the latest thing, needing to get new clothes, or, you're so stressed at work that you feel like you need to fly a long distance to go on holiday somewhere, which is not that great for the environment. So, yeah, like all these things connect together.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, so good.
Penny, as I research more about co-living and look into different organizations, I have not seen generally that much focus on environmental sustainability. And, I'm sure that because of the type of people that are drawn to this, I'm sure that within each co-living community, there is a lot of that, but I don't see a lot in the planning. And that was a big part of the core for us, um, leading us to, and a lot of the um, blame or uh, credit goes to our primary architect, who introduced me to the term permaculture, um, and really focus on sustainability, and encouraged me to look at hydroponics and aquaponics as a way to grow some of our food. Um, and so it's really embedded in our vision, but I'm not seeing a lot of it. A lot of it, uh, nationally and internationally, that I'm seeing is focused more on the facilities, and let's get people together, let's live together, and even less so on programming than I would have thought. Um, so I'm curious to hear what your experience has been regarding embracing sustainability. I think it's compatible with everyone's vision, but I'm not sure it's that much of a focus in most co-living communities. What's been your experience, and how do people receive it? Especially the corp. I know I'm adding on a lot of things, but especially those that are driven by corporate concerns. That we want this to make money. So what's been your experience there?
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that I guess let's try and break it down a bit. So you've got the really big players. Um, so I think I do genu- generally agree that I don't, I suspect that there are quite a lot of fairly good sustainability practices that happen in co-living spaces, partly because people are sharing amenities, and because sometimes sustainability practice aligns with affordability. So, make your heating more efficient, it will cost you less. Um, and also, it's more environmentally sustainable. Um, but I don't feel like it's really shouted about very much. So I think partly it's a marketing thing, that it's not necessarily talked about a lot. On in terms of sort of what's going on at stages of investment or planning, more and more now there is a lot of pressure on developers and on operators to talk about how they're going to be environmentally sustainable, which is great news. Um, so I do see more and more people are sort of referring to impact frameworks such as GRESB, um, or to how their co-living spaces will support certain sustainable development goals. So I think it's happening. Um, I think that the real estate sector as a whole is acknowledging that for the sake of long-term and secure investments, um, that their buildings need to be environmentally sustainable. And there is this kind of fear within the sector. They're anticipating that regulations will be coming in that will be stricter. Um, and so they don't want to be left behind. They don't want to build a building that then becomes worth nothing once regulations may change. So there's a lot of slightly nervous speculation on that part. And then you've got the slightly smaller players, the guys who are the startups. And from their part, I think what I've observed is that there's definitely the will to do it, but perhaps there's a knowledge gap on how to get there. So I guess for the most part, the startup guys, they're driven by being inspired by the idea of community. So they're very comfortable with that. They love that part. But although they want to do the environmental sustainability stuff, like, for the most part, who doesn't really? It's more a matter of, okay, but how do we do it? And that's why it's great that you've got someone on your team that sounds very knowledgeable, because it sounds like you've got a lot of exciting projects in the pipeline to make your spaces really sustainable.
And I think the fact that we are overarching our project is a not-for-profit corporation. So we're trying to take the profit motive out of the whole concept so that we're not having to shave off 15% or whatever for the developer or investor. We don't want to have investors that we have to have who will have undue influence. So and by taking the profit out, and also by having the community be a co-op structure, we can plow all of the money, whether it be the initial project cost or HOA fees, that all we're doing is just trying to sustain and not trying to make a profit out of it. One other, I want to see us produce as much as we can to offset some of the HOA fees and some of those fees, and things like having Tesla charging stations at our facilities, which could bring in some income. Maybe some, if the property is sufficiently large, maybe having a modest solar farm where we can provide some excess electricity in addition to our needs. And then back to conflict that you were talking about, one of my areas of background has been as a mediator of disputes. So, and I've trained hundreds of people to do mediation. So I'd love to train an in-house group to mediate our own internal disputes, and then be able to provide that service to the community, and have that be a revenue source to bring in some income for the group. So, so to me, sustainability is certainly about environmental issues, but it's also about having the community be able to raise some resources within in itself to not just be consumers of everything, but to produce and give back. So
yeah, for sure. That I mean, that sounds fantastic. And some of the things you're mentioning, a couple of the communities that I've worked with have done similar things. So one of them, a co-housing community who's intentional rather than professionally managed. They have a solar PV array, which eventually it paid for itself. And now they're using the profits of the electricity they sell back to the grid to invest in further sustainability infrastructures. So yeah, like that's fantastic that you guys are going to do that as well. And as far as the work goes, that reminded me actually of something that's come out of my research is this interesting cycle which happens when people live in communities. So a lot of people who live in particularly intentional communities, so their cost of living becomes more affordable. Um, so they will go part time. They might start a business that they have a passion for that's based on location, um, or they might go back into education. As a result, they're commuting less. They're not going out of the community as much. They're spending more time in the community. They're spending less time in salaried, sort of formal working hours, which means that they have more time to spend giving to the community, whether that's working on the allotment or spending social time together or, looking after someone's kids for an hour or two. And as a result, that kind of heightens the culture that forms within the community as well. So one lady that I interviewed mentioned that within her community, it wasn't a big deal for her at all to wear the same party dress that she's worn for the last 10 years to community occasions, whereas on the outside world you might feel a little bit self-conscious. Are people kind of judging me because I always wear the same clothes to special occasions? So that kind of highlights how uh, this kind of basing your work within the community somehow um, can kind of heighten these positive cultures, as well as making you more resilient as a community too.
it's cool.
That's awesome. So Penny, your organization is a consultancy. You're consultants. You're not creating your own co-living communities. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So
Okay.
yes, we consult with developers and operators, and we also have a kind of R&D arm as well. So one of our co-founders is one of the founders of Co-Living Insights, which is a co-living research lab and magazine.
Oh, no
Um,
kidding.
and we generally try and conduct our own research and stay up to date with the industry as well.
Awesome. Whereas we're creating a community in repurposed big box stores. And
Yes,
Mark, why
right.
don't you give Penny an overview, since she's less familiar with what we're doing?
Yeah, and for the sake of our listeners, I won't, and our regular listeners or viewers, I won't go into too much detail. But um, the origin of it is that I've actually lived in community for 30, 40 years on a farm, and had a family, small group that shares 30 acres outside of Louisville, Kentucky. So I've always been amenable to that. And as a baby boomer, right in that generation of old hippies, have always been so inclined. Um, and then in the last couple of years, I have broadened my business, which is a marketing business, down to Florida and in the Tampa St. Pete area. And I was looking for something a little more community oriented because of all the reasons that people are drawn to co-living, and just wasn't finding it. It's not very prevalent down there. I think there was one group in Miami, and that was too far south for me. So I was looking, didn't find it, and then about that same time, I read an article about all these big box stores that are emptying and sitting and some being reused, libraries and shopping malls too. And the two ideas just sort of came together that uh, what a great way to use those buildings, and a model of a big box store being converted into co-living just immediately came to me. That being loft condos around the perimeter, each with their own separate kitchens and baths. And that's a fortunate part of our design for COVID, because people would either be able to just isolate within their own units or shelter together as a community for those who could stay there. Um, and then in each of the corners of the big box to have community kitchens and activity areas that would support each quadrant, because we're looking at about 100 units. Most 2-bedroom loft condos, but some flats, some studios, some 3 bedrooms for young families. So, and then in the interior to have fitness, group meeting areas, co-working and co-learning that we'd like to combine together, as well as, depending on the location, and we want to have our first one in the St. Pete area, but expand to cool cities across the country and maybe worldwide. But Austin, Texas is a fun new city. Um, so and to be able to move between units, between communities, if somebody wants to explore a different area for a while and have it be part of the same system. So, and depending on the location, maybe some retail that would support the community, coffee shops, sandwich shops, a little small grocery or co-op grocery, and artist studios. So it just really would depend on the location, and invite people from the larger community to come in and shop in those uh, stores and come and sit in the open area in the center for coffee and snacks and that sort of thing.
And one of
So
my favorite parts about the Thrive Project is the multi-generational uh, I don't know what you call it, impact, where, you know, young people are learning from older people and vice versa. So you've got the millennials, you've got the boomers, and all the families in between. I
That's really
really
great.
love that, you know, sense of community and creating events and sharing knowledge and ideas and
Yeah,
and
yeah, that sounds brilliant. I do feel that as a society, we're quite segregated, aren't we? We
mm-hmm.
often end up just having friendship groups of our own age, and the only people who are older or younger that we generally communicate with is family normally, and maybe your next door neighbor if you happen to know them well and they happen to be of a different age
Right.
category to you. And yeah, there's so much we can learn from each other in terms of experiences and perspectives. So it's about time that we have more friendships with people who are not our age. So yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I used to homeschool my kids, and we had groups of homeschoolers. You know, we would do a reading club or we would do a writing club, and then my kids went to a school. It's kind of like someone else was homeschooling, but in both of those environments, there were different age kids, and so even in that small community, they all learned from each other, and they all had different experiences. And an older kid might be reading to a younger child on their lap and showing them
Mm-hmm.
math, things like that. It's just such a vibrant community feel,
Mm-hmm.
both that homeschooling environment and this larger community that we're talking about.
and I don't see that much. When I talk to other people in the co-living industry, and I don't, there's something about co-living industry. It sounds like an oxymoron. Um, maybe the community of co-living people. I don't know. Co-living and industry just doesn't seem to go together. Anyway, um, I hear a lot of aspiration to have multi-generational communities, but it ends up, most of them seem to be 20 somethings and up to mid 30 somethings. So I think it may take a lot of effort. Although, since a lot of us that are involved in our project are older, um, I think I think we can more successfully draw older people. Um, but I think artists and creatives of all sorts will be drawn to this, as well as entrepreneurs and energetic business people.
Mhm.
You know, one thing I'd like to focus on, if we could, is you and your background and your path to this point. Um, and hopefully, this won't embarrass you too much. But if I were to pick a personality type that would be the greatest asset as an advocate um, for this concept, it would be your persona. I mean, you are so kind
Oh,
and soft spoken, and so I'd like to hear a little bit more about who you are and what brought you to this point, and your focus on co-living, because you just epitomize. You could be the poster child for co-living.
oh, thank you. That's very, very kind of you. Thank you. What a nice thing to say. um, well, my my path towards here, I think, began actually back in 2015. So not so very long ago, when I was doing my masters. So my masters was in social research methods, which sounds like quite a dry kind of subject. You know, I'm learning how to be a researcher, learning how to do surveys and conduct interviews, and all this kind of thing. And while I was doing my masters, so you know, when you get to a master's level, you kind of get to choose what you focus on a bit more, particularly so with the research module, because every time you have an assignment, they're like, okay, decide your own topic. And so I kind of decided in a very, I don't know, kind of a very conscious way, what's really important. Environmental sustainability, that's important. That's what I'm going to focus on for each of my assignments. So for every assignment, I would try and find the sustainability angle, with a view that eventually, it would be good to learn about this. It could turn into something useful eventually. And so there's many different ways in which you can approach environmental sustainability. And somehow, I don't quite remember how, somehow I came across eco villages. And that kind of struck a chord, because it's a really beautiful idea, right? Everybody living in this village together, living this green life with the trees and the flowers and growing their own vegetables. Um, so for my master's dissertation, I went and I visited a few different eco villages, and I basically asked people, who are you and what brought you here? And I guess I was genuinely very interested in this question on a personal level. So I got to speak to a lot of people who lived in eco villages, and I think this is where, for me, the themes of connection first started occurring, because one thing I walked away with from this research with people in eco villages is that the things they kept talking about kept coming back to connecting with the land through kind of autonomy and growing your own food, and connecting with other people as well. Um, so they're like, I guess for me, like a seed was planted there, I suppose you could say. Um, and then coming away from that, I knew that I wanted to go on and do a PhD, and that I was interested in um, this question of, well, we all know things need to change. We all know we need to change the way we live. The UN says so. We better do it and quick. But why is it so hard? Like, we kind of know what we have to do, but why is it so hard to actually do it? And I was still interested in communities as a possible way for practices to change and practices to be spread because of this social influence thing. Um, and then I was also, I love the eco villages. They're wonderful places, but it's not a solution for everyone. We can't all move out of the city, and go and live in an eco-village. So then that's when I began to think, okay, is there an urban equivalent of an eco-village? And that's how I got to co-housing, which co-housing, I'm sure you guys know, but just in case, is very similar to co-living, but you have more private space. So you have your own front door, but you still have communal space. You still share your meals and have the intention to share some element of your lives with each other. So I discovered co-housing, started my PhD, was researching that, and then that's when the word co-living started cropping up all the time. And I kind of thought, aha, right, well, I can't talk about shared living if I'm not talking about the latest iteration, which is co-living. So that's kind of the steps that I took to get to where I am. So yeah, it all began with a love of eco villages. So in some sense, I would like us all to be able to embody the spirit of the eco village, but in an urban setting.
I love that. It's a great story. Just kind of following breadcrumbs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, and how about yourselves? Like, what brought you guys to this point of Thrive co-living?
Why don't you go first, Jennifer?
Well, our story, or my story, is a little unusual or kind of funny. Last year, my boyfriend was living in Florida while I lived in Maine, and he met Mark at a dog park, and they were the only ones there, and they walked and talked for about an hour. And I have my own business, as I mentioned, as a life coach, and my boyfriend at the time, he's now my husband, but Keith said to Mark, you and Jennifer might want to connect, and I bet you could help her out with marketing and stuff like that. And so we connected on that first step, and then I learned about Thrive, and I was all in. I'm like, this is so exciting. This is so cool. What a great use for repurposed, or the dead big box stores that are just sitting there. And I love the sense of the community, and so I became an advisory member and this podcast co-host, and I'm just kicking around doing stuff because I believe in the project. Really, that's what it boils down to.
Oh, awesome.
They have bought a van, and they're going to be touring the country. But when they land somewhere, I bet it's going to be in St. Pete at Thrive.
That's right, exactly. When we're done.
And your mother's already signed up.
Oh yeah,
so.
she's in. She thinks
Oh,
it'll be
amazing.
great. Yeah. So we're definitely excited about the project. Love the idea of living in a warmer climate. Maine gets awfully cold in the winter. And yeah, I think it's really great.
Oh, great. Wow, what a happy coincidence.
I know. Yeah, because
Fateful walk
Mark
in
and
the
I
dog park.
have we talk to each other, I don't know, 10 times a week at this point. Probably.
And I feel like I've covered all that from my background, so I won't redo it. But one thing I'd like to talk about and get your thoughts on is this whole sense of community and building community, and the things that we need to do in terms of activities and practices. I also hear the smaller operators talking a lot about community, but some of the larger ones, again, they're more focused on the physical facility and just housing people. And I think they're coming to programming about community after the fact. And to us, I think the programming, having regular programming, bringing people to share their own passions, having their friends come and share passions, and doing fun things like wine tastings and food demonstrations and community dinners and bingo night and amateur talent night, and just having programming going on, not too much that people will get saturated with it, but several times a week. So what are some of your thoughts around best practices? That sounds too institutional too. Best ideas for building community and activities and that sort of thing.
Okay. So I think okay, I'd like to borrow from an academic called Arensen, who talks about three particular elements which tend to generate what she refers to as collaborative neighborhoods, but essentially what I think you can define as like a lovely community. So the first thing she talks about is simply co-presence. So people need to just spend time around each other, which makes sense, right? Second thing is affiliation. So people need to have things in common with one another, and that can be anything from, you know, very deep-seated values to we all like soccer, or, you know, anything you like, or we all have a dog. And then the third one, and probably the most elusive in a way, the most difficult, but maybe the most valuable one is endeavor, a shared endeavor. So when you do things, when you engage in work together, that is very good for forming a sense of community and bonds with one another. So when I think about events programming, I like to come from these three principles. Or I guess it's a bit wider than just events programming. When I think about community life, like how do we encourage our members to have these three things? How do we encourage them to spend time in each other's presence? How do we draw out what they have in common? Or how do we curate for what they have in common? And that can mean, so you can have, of course, you have an intergenerational community, you have a diverse community in other ways, but maybe there's something between them that they share that goes deeper than age or ethnicity or gender. And how about endeavor as well? How can we get people to engage in work together? And that might be, it could be work as simple as after a shared meal, we clear up together. Or it could be work like we grow food together, or we start a business together. You know, it can be any kind of work. And then I think in terms of what kind of events you have, um, I think there, you know, it's an iterative process, isn't it? You have to start something off. You have to come in with some suggestions, and those suggestions should be based on, okay, what kind of people are here? And then you have to have some really good feedback loops to really understand how is it people feel about these events. And some of these feedback loops will simply be attendance. Are people turning up? That's a good sign as to whether the event is working or not. But also like allowing people to feel that they genuinely can give feedback. And maybe there's a cultural difference here, but certainly like in the UK, it would be very difficult to get some genuine criticism from people. They just go, "Oh, it was lovely, thanks," and then you'd never see them again. Maybe it's not like that everywhere else, but it can be quite hard. And then I guess the last comment I'd make is that it's good, and I'm sure you thought of this, but it's good to create an environment in which people feel empowered to suggest their own events, which of course in the end benefits the operator as well, because that's actually less work for them to do. So I think, yeah, kind of responsiveness and empowering people as far as events programming goes is great. And then bearing in mind those three things of what helps bring a community together, drawing out what they have in common, spending time together, and if you can, shared work can have a magical effect.
Nice. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about I'm very into technology, and I've been thinking about what kind of software or platform would facilitate this sense of community the best. And when I met with Ajay just last week, and he has software that's more about managing the facility and rent, collection of rent, and communications and that sort of thing. But I'm starting to think about um, what kind of platform, and I don't think Facebook groups is going to be sufficient. I think it needs to have a community calendar, um, a message board, so that people can put out and have it heard at 2. Who at 2 in the morning wants to get a pizza with me and meet me in the courtyard and eat pizza? Or I want to go kayaking this Saturday. Who's open to going kayaking between 2 and 5 on Saturday? Um, so I'm just starting to think about that, and that may be something that we, as our community, our not-for-profit, can contribute, because it is an area of interest, and I do build some software, although it's a painful process. So I'm not sure that I want to bite it off at this point. But anyway, do you have, and I know we probably need to wrap up soon, but do you have thoughts, and as you've talked to communities, have you seen anything that's off the shelf software that communities are using that seems to fulfill all of the different needs, communication needs that a community would have to have?
Mm. Yeah, it's a really big question, and it's one that I think pretty much every co-living operator slash developer is asking. What tech can we have to cover all these different needs? The short answer is, like, to be honest, no, I haven't really seen anything that really, you know, ticks the box like that. So I've seen in some co-living spaces, they will tend to have a bespoke app that's been made. Um, I've seen, so WhatsApp is very popular with many co-living spaces. I think just because it's the thing people are familiar with and are happy to use. Um, and then I've seen in other communities Slack being used as well. And I guess that's nice because you can kind of check in when you want. You can change what your notifications are, and then you have different conversation streams, so you're not bombarded with everything all the time. Um, one thing I think I've seen is, communities starting, maybe they start with an app, and then they find, okay, the residents are using the app for this. Or, like, for example, one operator I spoke to said, we have this app that kind of, it does everything. Um, Community members would use it for the maintenance function, so they use it to report their maintenance issues. But we had a whole social side, and people didn't really use that. They just ended up going back to Facebook or WhatsApp instead, and using that. So I think, again, there's this kind of iteration thing where you can set it up with best hopes of how people will use it, but you don't always know how people are going to use the things which you make, which is the case with any kind of product you make. um, and I think as well, with technology, a very typical um, sort of a very typical thing that happens is that the people who make the technology, they make it pristine and perfect, right, ready to be used, and then it gets put into real life, and the users don't really get a very good induction, and they don't really get how to use it, and they don't start to adopt it into their everyday lives, and so it gets forgotten. So I think just as important as the technology itself is how you help the users um, adapt that technology into their everyday lives and routines. So yeah, I'm afraid I haven't got a good answer of, like, the this is the kind of technology that a lot of operators are using, or necessarily that they should be using. Um, but what I would say is, like, paying a lot of attention to how it's adapted into everyday life and routine will really help a lot in actually making that technology work, whatever it is.
Hmm.
Makes a lot of sense. Making sure there's support there for
Mm-hmm.
using the software, whatever the
Mm-hmm.
technology is.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. All right, Mark, any last questions on your end?
I think this is probably a good stopping point. I really appreciate
Yeah.
you spending time with us. And again, um, I want us to stay connected, and communicating, and maybe do another podcast, because I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. Co-living is so multifaceted that there's a lot to consider. But I really appreciate what you are doing and your organization, and I think we hope to do some consulting once we've created a good model, and to be able to go to other cities and help replicate that model once we've learned our initial lessons. Not that we'll have all of them, but
Yeah, that
so
sounds fantastic. Yeah, well, and so what is next for Thrive Co-Living?
well, that's a good segue into our GoFundMe campaign. Thank you.
This wasn't
So
even planned, I swear.
so we are initiating a GoFundMe campaign to do some basic planning and have some renderings done, as well as some other administrative things that we've done. So that's the next step, because we really have not done any fundraising at all. We feel like there are some progressive foundations out there that realize, especially on the West Coast of the US, that are technology oriented, that have a sensitivity to the fact that technology, although wonderful, is driving us further apart. So I think we'll get some support from foundations to work on our model, and then the next step will be to find a location, and we're looking at several of them in the St. Petersburg area, and begin to draw our group together and gather 100 people or 100 families who are ready to do this, and get the commitments, and start building or repurposing our facility.
It's very exciting stuff. Yeah, I'd love to stay tuned and see how things develop.
And some of your research, I'm sure, would be helpful for us. So let's definitely stay connected.
Yeah,
Jennifer,
absolutely.
other thoughts from you?
I think just to draw people to our GoFundMe campaign, the link is or will be in the show notes below this YouTube video. And for people who are listening to the audio version, please go to our website, thrivecolivingcommunities.org. There will be a link there. And we're looking for support to get Thrive off the ground. We're excited. Thank you, Penny, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your stories and guidance. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to chat.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Thrive Co-Living podcast and YouTube broadcast. To discover more about our mission, activities, and how to find us on social media, please check out our website at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. There you can also learn how you can support this creative vision in community co-living. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon.